A dangerous man operates differently. He understands that markets can crash, jobs can disappear, relationships can end, opportunities can vanish, and entire plans can fail overnight. Yet one asset remains available through every season of life: himself. His ability to learn, his ability to work, his ability to endure pressure, his ability to solve problems, his ability to start again. Once a man truly understands that, fear begins losing its grip, because the source of confidence moves inward instead of outward. Look carefully at why most people hesitate when meaningful opportunities appear. Rarely is it because the opportunity itself lacks potential. More often, the hesitation comes from a deeper issue. They do not trust themselves enough to handle uncertainty. The investment feels risky. The business feels risky. The new career feels risky. The ambitious goal feels risky. Yet what they are actually saying beneath the surface is something much more revealing. They do not believe they can adapt if things go wrong. That is the real fear. Uncertainty becomes terrifying when a person secretly doubts their own capability. A man who trusts himself approaches risk differently. Failure still carries consequences. Difficulty still exists. Pressure still exists. Yet he understands something important. Even if the first plan collapses, he remains. Even if the path changes, he remains. Even if the strategy fails, he remains. Skills remain, experience remains, lessons remain, resilience remains. Most people fear losing because they built their confidence around outcomes. Strong men build confidence around their ability to survive outcomes. A weak mindset constantly searches for guarantees before action begins. It wants certainty before commitment. It wants proof before effort. It wants safety before movement. The problem is that life rarely provides guarantees worth having. Every meaningful achievement contains uncertainty somewhere in the equation. Every important relationship involves risk. Every ambitious goal requires faith. Every worthwhile challenge demands movement before complete confidence arrives. Waiting for absolute certainty becomes a sophisticated form of avoidance, because certainty usually appears after action, not before it. This is why many intelligent people remain stuck, while less talented people move ahead. Intelligence often creates more reasons to hesitate. Self-trust creates movement. The man who believes in his ability to adapt eventually accumulates more experience, more skill, more resilience, and more evidence because he enters situations others spend years analyzing from a distance. Most people misunderstand failure because they evaluate it incorrectly. They think failure means losing. They think failure means the outcome did not match the plan. They think failure means wasted effort. Yet the strongest individuals often see things differently because they understand that growth compounds through exposure. A difficult project builds capability. A failed business builds experience. A challenging conversation builds confidence. A disciplined year builds identity. A rejected opportunity builds resilience. A setback builds adaptation. The result may not arrive immediately, but the person emerges stronger than before. This is why investing in yourself operates differently than almost every other investment on earth. External investments can disappear completely. Internal investments continue producing returns long after the original effort ended. Every skill learned, every challenge survived, every disciplined habit built, every difficult lesson absorbed remains available for future use. The world can take many things from a man. It struggles to take capability. Consider the physical body for a moment, because it reveals this principle clearly. Every workout looks small while it is happening. One session changes almost nothing. One early morning changes almost nothing. One disciplined meal changes almost nothing. Yet repetition transforms the body dramatically over time. Strength accumulates. Endurance accumulates. Confidence accumulates. The investment compounds because the person changes. The same principle applies psychologically. Every difficult task completed strengthens self-trust slightly. Every promise kept strengthens self-respect slightly. Every challenge entered voluntarily strengthens resilience slightly. Eventually, the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. A man begins carrying himself differently because he knows something most people never learn. He can rely on himself. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, reliably. That knowledge creates a level of internal stability external validation can never replicate.
A man who never consciously decides what he wants often ends up living according to goals, values, priorities, and definitions of success inherited from people he never deliberately selected as architects of his life. The tragedy is not that society offers paths. The tragedy is that most people never stop long enough to ask whether the path belongs to them. Observe the average life closely, and a pattern begins appearing almost immediately. Study, work, consume, repeat. Not because those activities are inherently wrong, but because many people arrive at them without ever conducting a serious examination of alternatives. They move from one stage to the next through momentum rather than intention. One decision leads to another. One expectation creates another. One safe choice generates the next safe choice. Suddenly, a decade disappears, then another. Eventually, the individual wakes up one morning feeling strangely disconnected from his own existence because he spent years managing a life he inherited instead of constructing a life he consciously designed. The body shows up to work, the routines continue functioning, the responsibilities remain fulfilled, yet something deeper feels absent, not because the person lacks intelligence, not because opportunity never appeared, because independent thought was replaced by passive acceptance. The current was so strong that questioning the direction felt unnecessary until the distance already traveled became impossible to ignore. Independent thinking begins where social momentum ends. That sounds simple until you realize how uncomfortable genuine independent thought actually feels. It requires uncertainty. It requires disagreement. It requires periods where people misunderstand your decisions because they are measuring your life through standards that no longer apply to you. Most individuals avoid this process because belonging feels safer than exploration. Approval feels safer than experimentation. Familiarity feels safer than discovery. Yet every meaningful life eventually requires a period where a person separates his own voice from the voices surrounding him. Not permanently, not rebelliously for its own sake, intelligently, deliberately. Otherwise, every major decision becomes contaminated by external expectations. Career choices become social decisions. Relationships become social decisions. Ambitions become social decisions. Entire futures become social decisions. The individual disappears beneath the weight of collective assumptions, while still believing he is acting freely. Look at the people who built unusual lives worth remembering, and you will notice something uncomfortable. Nearly all of them passed through periods where their decisions looked irrational to others. Entrepreneurs left secure paths. Artists pursued uncertain futures. Innovators ignored conventional wisdom. Explorers walked away from predictable lives. Creators spent years building things nobody initially understood. They were not necessarily smarter than everyone else. They simply trusted their own observations enough to investigate possibilities others dismissed automatically. The crowd usually rewards conformity because conformity preserves stability. Originality creates uncertainty. This is why independent thought often feels lonely at first. The person begins seeing options invisible to people still operating within accepted frameworks. New possibilities emerge. Different questions emerge. Alternative definitions of success emerge. That shift creates distance between the thinker and the crowd, at least temporarily. Most people retreat at that point because the social discomfort feels too expensive. The stronger individual continues exploring anyway. The first layer of this idea is practical. If you do not decide what matters, something else will decide for you. Attention will be directed by algorithms. Ambition will be directed by comparison. Identity will be directed by trends. Time will be directed by convenience. Consumption will be directed by marketing. The modern world contains countless systems competing aggressively for your focus, because focus eventually becomes behavior. Behavior becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. Every hour spent drifting unconsciously strengthens someone else's influence over your future. This is why clarity matters. Not because clarity guarantees success, but because clarity creates direction. Without direction, outside forces fill the vacuum automatically. Human beings dislike uncertainty, so they often borrow goals from the people around them instead of enduring the discomfort required to discover their own. Borrowed goals create borrowed lives. The second layer becomes psychological. The longer a person follows a path he never consciously chose, the harder it becomes to leave because identity starts forming around the path itself. He introduces himself through it, measures himself through it, organizes his routines around it, builds relationships around it, structures expectations around it. Eventually, questioning the path begins feeling like questioning himself. This creates a dangerous trap. The individual becomes loyal to a life structure that no longer serves him. Because changing direction would require confronting years of investment, habit, and social expectation. Many people remain stuck here indefinitely. They continue climbing ladders, leaning against walls they never wanted to reach. They continue pursuing goals that no longer inspire them because abandoning the pursuit feels more frightening than continuing it. Time becomes the prison guard. Familiarity becomes the lock. This matters because human beings possess a remarkable ability to adapt to almost any situation, including situations that quietly drain them. A person can become accustomed to mediocrity, accustomed to dissatisfaction, accustomed to low energy, accustomed to work that feels meaningless, accustomed to routines that produce no excitement or growth. Adaptation keeps the body functioning, yet adaptation can also hide problems. The nervous system normalizes environments repeated often enough. That normalization creates the illusion that everything is fine simply because everything is familiar. Then one day the realization arrives. Years have passed. Potential has remained largely untouched. Curiosity has weakened. Ambition has narrowed. The person did not fail dramatically. He drifted. Drift is dangerous because it feels comfortable while it is happening. Only later does the cost become visible. A serious man understands that exploration carries risk, yet he also understands that avoiding exploration carries its own risk, often a much larger one. The risk of trying something meaningful and failing receives enormous attention because failure is visible. The risk of never trying receives almost none because regret accumulates silently. One hurts immediately, the other hurts gradually. Most people choose the gradual pain because it feels manageable day to day. They suppress curiosity, delay ambition, ignore instincts, dismiss possibilities, convince themselves practical concerns require permanent surrender of deeper desires. Then, decades later, they discover that practical decisions made repeatedly can create profoundly impractical lives. A life built entirely around safety often becomes emotionally expensive. Security without meaning eventually starts feeling like confinement. Changing this begins with questions rather than answers. What would you pursue if approval disappeared from the equation completely? What interests survive when comparison is removed? What kind of work energizes you enough that effort feels worthwhile? What skills would you develop even without immediate recognition? Which activities make time disappear naturally? Which ambitions keep returning no matter how often you try to ignore them? These questions matter because authentic direction rarely appears through external instruction. It emerges through observation. Patterns reveal themselves gradually. Curiosity reveals itself gradually. The strongest paths often begin as persistent interests that refuse to disappear despite years of neglect. Most people already possess clues. They simply keep drowning those clues beneath noise, obligation, distraction, and expectation.
Psychologists call this an internal locus of control, yet long before researchers gave it a name, strong men understood the principle instinctively. They understood that while circumstances matter, the interpretation of circumstances often matters more. Two people can face identical setbacks and emerge with completely different futures because one asks, "Why is this happening to me?" while the other asks, "What can I do now?" That difference appears small on paper. In reality, it changes everything. One question directs attention toward helplessness. The other directs attention toward action. One trains the nervous system to search for excuses. The other trains it to search for solutions. Over time, these mental habits compound. The first person becomes increasingly dependent on favorable conditions before moving. The second becomes increasingly capable of creating momentum despite unfavorable conditions. Eventually, the gap between them becomes enormous, even if they started from similar positions. Look at how this appears in ordinary life. A man wants a stronger body but spends years talking about genetics, schedules, age, work obligations, family obligations, injuries, weather, motivation, and every external factor imaginable. Another man acknowledges those same obstacles, then trains anyway. One waits for circumstances to improve before acting. The other acts while circumstances remain imperfect. 5 years later, the difference becomes visible. The body changed, the confidence changed, the energy changed, the identity changed. What created the gap was not merely effort, it was orientation. One man kept directing attention outward. The other kept directing attention inward. The first asked whether conditions were ideal. The second asked what he could control immediately. Every meaningful area of life follows this pattern. Business, relationships, discipline, learning, leadership. The direction of responsibility determines the direction of growth. If you constantly explain outcomes through external forces, the nervous system gradually stops looking for personal influence. Failure becomes something that happens to you. Success becomes something granted to you. Opportunity becomes something discovered accidentally rather than created intentionally. This mindset feels harmless at first because it removes emotional discomfort temporarily. Yet over time it creates passivity. A passive person waits for permission before moving, waits for certainty before deciding, waits for approval before acting, waits for confidence before beginning. Life becomes an endless waiting room. Meanwhile, years disappear. The person remains stuck, not because opportunity never appeared, but because responsibility was outsourced so completely that action no longer felt necessary until perfect conditions arrived. Every time a man solves a problem independently, keeps a difficult promise, survives uncertainty, develops a skill, improves a weakness, or adapts under pressure, the brain records evidence. That evidence accumulates. The nervous system begins learning something powerful. I can influence outcomes. This lesson changes identity. Confidence starts emerging from proof rather than imagination. Self-respect begins growing from behavior rather than external praise. Anxiety often decreases because attention remains focused on controllable variables instead of uncontrollable ones. A man who repeatedly experiences himself as capable develops a fundamentally different relationship with challenge. He stops viewing difficulty as a threat to identity and starts viewing difficulty as an opportunity to exercise capability. That shift creates resilience because resilience depends largely on perceived influence. Many people spend years waiting for validation before fully committing to themselves. They want confirmation first. They want applause first. They want evidence from the world before they provide evidence to themselves. They want guarantees that the effort will pay off before they invest deeply. Yet the world almost never works that way. Recognition usually follows commitment. Respect usually follows competence. Opportunity usually follows preparation. Results usually follow repetition. The person who waits for validation before acting creates a vicious cycle because action never reaches the level necessary to produce meaningful results. The stronger individual reverses the sequence. He commits before validation arrives. He develops skills before recognition appears. He builds before applause exists. The external world eventually notices, but by then the work was already happening internally for years. This matters because external validation is one of the most unstable foundations a person can build upon. Public opinion changes quickly. Trends change quickly. Markets change quickly. Social approval changes quickly. If your motivation depends entirely on outside recognition, then your consistency becomes fragile because the source of confidence remains outside your control. The man operating from an internal locus builds something much stronger. His standards do not fluctuate dramatically based on public reaction. His effort does not depend entirely on encouragement. His discipline survives periods where nobody notices progress. This creates an enormous advantage because meaningful achievements often require long stretches of invisible work. Most people quit during those periods because external rewards remain absent. The internally driven individual continues because his relationship with effort is not entirely dependent on applause.